We still have the image of stock exchanges today with all these people in their jackets waving their bits of paper, and who knows what's really going on. But a lot of that is happening in the streets and alleyways and coffee houses of London. And that's when you get the emergence of that kind of stock market energy.
Welcome to History's Greatest Scandals. In this series, we're uncovering the secrets of the Georgian era. And joining me to explore the highs and lows of British society in the 18th and early 19th centuries is Professor Hannah Greig, a historian, author, and a historical consultant on dramas including Poldark, The Favourite, and Bridgerton. We'll be following on the trail of forgers, uncovering illicit liaisons, meeting cross-dressing celebrity spies, and getting involved in some high-stakes gambling, as we search out some of the biggest scandals of the day and explore what they can reveal about the Georgian age.
You may not want to answer this question, Ellie, but have you ever made a risky investment?
Well, no, I'm not a gambler. With my money, I like to play it safe rather than take a risk.
Well, that's probably very sensible because unfortunately for lots of the people we are going to meet in our story today, they did not play it safe and they didn't take the same approach at all. And right now we're going to head to 1720 for a story of greed, of risk and delusion, a scandal that is basically the world's first major financial crash. So imagine you are in London in 1720. It's October the 22nd and you're opening your newspaper, perhaps over breakfast or in a coffee house. And in one of the papers, the Weekly Journal or Saturday's Post, there's a report of a very unruly fight that had broken out the night before in London. Now, this fight was not your typical kind of run-of-the-mill street brawl. The fight had broken out between gentlemen, investors who just received some very bad news. They'd put their money into a scheme that had promised that they would get rich quick. But, as they had recently learned, they had all been very badly burned. So, with a lot of worry about what was at stake, about concerns about how to get their money back, these men had met up to see if there was anything that could be done about what they called the present unhappy state of their affairs. But before long, the worries get the better of them, accusations begin to fly, and the men, made desperate by misfortune, gave loose to their passions and let fly warm expressions. Basically, they start beating each other up. This business meeting kind of come barroom brawl ended up being broken up by an official who turns up and threatens to read them the riot act unless they disperse, which they do. So what was the trigger then of this massive fight? How had they lost their fortunes overnight? Well, it was down to something called the South Sea Bubble.
Okay, so we're going to get into economics in this episode, which can be quite complex, but we're going to try and break it down for people. What was the South Sea Bubble, as it was known, and how did it burst in October 1720?
Well, first of all, it relates to the South Sea Company, which was a joint stock trading company. And just to keep the story fairly simple, Britain had secured the rights relatively recently to what was known as the South Sea Trade. And it had secured this right through the terms and conditions of a treaty, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which had brought an end to a war with France that was known as the War of the Spanish Succession, which had been running for at least the past 10 years previously. Now, the South Sea is what we would call kind of Central and South America, effectively, and they were the location of a number of Spanish-owned plantations, Spanish trading routes, and those lands and those right to trade became caught up in this Treaty of Utrecht because Spain had been an ally of France during the war. What happens is the South Sea Company is formed in order to exploit these new opportunities created by the treaty. And the South Sea Company is formed very specifically to purchase the rights to the contract for trade in exchange for about £9 million which is a very precise sum of money because it represents the national debt. And it's a way of rebundling the national debt. So in the years of the war, the British government has run up a huge amount. It's been very costly. They have a significant amount of debt that they're now carrying. And so the creation of a company to buy the rights to the trading contract is a kind of complicated way of reorganising that debt. And what happens is government creditors, so the people who owed the money through the national debt, instead of being repaid, are simply given shares in the South Sea Company. And they are led to believe that instead of the debt being repaid, they would make a profit from these new trade routes that were being managed through the South Sea Company. And that the buying and selling of shares in this company would also be a way in which their financial fortunes could be restored.
Okay, so that's a really good breakdown of quite a complex setup there. But did this idea of being able to buy shares of this company, did that appeal to investors?
Well, yes, definitely, because there's a kind of promise of a greater return than they would otherwise have had. There's a sort of hope that these trading opportunities will generate, guaranteed wealth and riches. And also it's made even more attractive because it's not simply the fact of the buying and selling through the trading routes, which seems to offer the opportunity to make money, but actually the buying and selling of the shares in the company itself. So the idea in which the company could be presented as an opportunity, not just for the very rich, but for other members of the public to participate in this scheme, to join this exciting moment of kind of economic buoyancy. And so the South Sea Company sort of becomes puffed as a get-rich-quick scheme to a very wide range of people.
Because I guess it was drawing on existing companies and trading ventures abroad that had done very well, so it seemed viable?
Well, yeah, of course. It's not a completely new innovation in terms of how money might be made. I mean, Britain is beginning to emerge as an important global trading power by this time. Lots of people are seeing ships and shipping routes as a way to make a massive fortune. The idea of going away to sea and trading in the East India Company and then coming back with a massive fortune was something that was quite familiar to people of the 1720s. So there seemed to be something real there, some real promise, some real hope that opportunity for enrichment would be possible through this particular scheme, buying shares in the South Sea Company.
And promises like that of getting rich quick, investing in the latest, hottest thing and it booming, they can be very hard to resist, can't they? So I'm imagining people put a fair amount of money into this.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. What begins to happen quite rapidly, particularly in 1720, as stocks and shares in the company begin to be sold more and more rapidly. They're passing hands between people. So obviously the value of those shares begins to be inflated because there seems to be a huge amount of demand for them. There's a product, the stock, effectively, and lots of people want in. So the value of that stock begins to rise. And so it seems as though the promise of return is almost guaranteed. And there's an energy to it that begins to take over the City of London and almost the nation as a whole, because the newspapers report the fluctuations in the share prices. They report stories of people rushing forward to buy stock, of people spending huge amounts of money on that stock. So, for instance, on May 21st, the London Journal, for example, says they'd heard of a noble peer who had spent £6,000 in 1 week on South Sea stock, and the next week he returns for even more because he's hopeful that he'll be able to transform all of that money into an even greater fortune. So people seem to be speculating just almost everything on this, and at least that's what the stories are that the newspaper is portraying. And it's also clearly not just of interest to those who have the financial ability to invest £6,000, which is just massive. But there's also a sense in which ordinary people are participating in this frenzied activity to join the scheme. So newspapers carry advertisements for syndicates, so where people can pool their limited resources and buy stock together. So an example of that is an advertisement in the Post Boy newspaper from July the 9th, 1720, which carries an advertisement that says, "Any persons that has a mind to put any sum or sums of money into the hands of Matthew West, who's a goldsmith in London, for purchasing South Sea stock, now stocks being very high and out of the reach of many persons, for the benefit of those who cannot spare £1,000 or £500, but may spare a small sum, which if improved may turn to a very good account." So it's a convoluted way of Matthew West saying, if you give me a little bit of money, I'll pool all of those little bits for everybody. We'll buy some stocks and shares, and then you're going to make a massive fortune in return. So there's a sense in which you want to be in this scheme. You don't want to miss out. And that the returns are absolutely, gold-plated guaranteed. And it's just exciting. It's energetic. It's a new form of kind of buying and trading in the City of London at the time.
And I guess those syndicates indicate that people lower down the social scale are looking at these wealthy individuals chucking $6,000 into this and thinking, well, if they're making all of this money on this, why can't I?
Yes, yeah. And there's also a sense in which they don't want to miss it. They don't want to miss the moment because, of course, the more that people start buying into the scheme, the more the sense is that you don't want to be the only one not. And so you do get a kind of sense of contemporary commentary of people congratulating people on the success they've had, on the improvement of their shares, and saying, well, actually, maybe I'll have a little dabble too. Maybe this is something that we should all be joining in with. But there were some early concerns that this might not all, end happily. So some of the energy around this kind of excitement for investing in South Sea Company is shown as some contemporary prints. So Ellie, if you have a look at this one, which actually takes us into an imaginary scene in a coffee house in the City of London.
So coffee houses at the time, a lot of business was done there as well as socialising, is that right?
Well, it's also the origins of the stock exchange. It's a place where people shared information about values and of stocks and shares and things like that. Yeah.
So we have this scene in the coffee house. We've got a lot of different men kind of gathered around tables with speech bubbles coming out. Can you explain what exactly is happening here? What are they talking about?
Yes, we see lots of gentlemen clustered around tables, all involved in very busy chat. Some of them are saying things like, I have sold my manor and purchased stock. Another one is saying, I've laid out not only my estate, but also that of my ward. So there's a sense of these people speculating huge amounts into the South Sea Company.
And there's a title here in Latin. I can't do Latin. What's it say?
I'm not great at it either. But I think it can be translated along the lines of, if people want to be deceived, let them be deceived. So there's a sense in which these people are potentially foolish, that they are, following a path or fool's gold, basically, that it's not going to end in great riches at all. So there's the beginning of a kind of suggestion that this bubble is about to burst.
So there is a sense that lots of people were drawn into this seemingly dazzling investment opportunity then.
Yes. I mean, we have these newspaper reports which are showing these advertisements for syndicates, reporting about people, investing huge amounts of money in South Sea stock.
So in that print that we looked at of the coffee house, everyone in there is a man. They look like they could be a banker, they could be an investor. Was it limited to that pool of people?
No, certainly we know that, women were investing as well. We find from their letters and their correspondence that they were very aware of the South Sea Company, that they were also using some of their own money to buy and sell shares. And actually, if you look at this painting, which is a 19th century painting, so it's a fictional imagining of this South Sea moment, then you can see a whole kind of cluster of different sorts of people participating in the energy of the streets of London. Yeah,
so looking at this painting, it's by Edward Matthew Ward. And as you say, you wouldn't look at the scene and think it was bankers. We've got people in all different kind of professions, a guy who looks like he's maybe in the army, a couple of women of different ages, even children kind of getting in on the action, I imagine, not making the investment. But this sense of, the painting gives this real sense of a clamour, a desperation to get involved and a real excitement and a kind of optimism, I guess.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult for us to get a real sense of exactly who was investing and how much money they're investing at any time, because we only have a few little anecdotes here and there. But also if we look at contemporary letters at the time, we find other people recording the frenzy that seemed to have taken over London as people were rushing forward to participate in this scheme. So one example is a Mrs. Molesworth who writes to her friend about this moment. And Ellie, why don't you have a look at her letter?
Okay, so she writes, I am almost South Sea mad, and I find that the philosophic temper of mind which made me content under my circumstances, when there was no seeming probability of bettering them, forsakes me on this occasion, and I cannot, without great regret, reflect that, for want of a little money, I'm forced to let slip an opportunity which is never like to happen again. So it's again this like idea of fear of missing out.
Yes.
That she wants to be in on the action and everybody else is getting involved. And if you don't take part, you're going to look like a fool later.
Yes. So that you're going to miss out, that everyone's doing it, so why shouldn't you? If you don't have the means to invest in it, is this amazing golden opportunity going to slip through your fingers? It suggested that everybody was scrambling to participate, everyone from the very highest, so the king himself, right down to ordinary people, footmen, servants, anybody who had anything to spare was just trying to get in on the action. And because of this, of course, what happens is the value of the stocks in the South Sea Company rise incredibly rapidly in 1720. In the course of a few months between April and June, the stock value had almost tripled. It seemed to just be going up and up and up and up.
But when something seems too good to be true, very often it is. When did this bubble then finally burst?
So very rapidly, the story begins to change. And in October 1720, the value of the shares begins to come down. And actually, it comes down even more rapidly than it goes up. And clearly, this bubble, this moment, has burst. The value of the shares completely crashes, falling far below their original value. And as all sound investors would now know, the value of your investments can go down as well as go up. And a lot of people suddenly learnt this lesson very, very quickly indeed in October 1720.
So tell us more about the company at the heart of all of this, the South Sea Company.
So the South Sea Company has really been established really from 1711, but it becomes more substantial after 1713. And it was established to profit from a monopoly over the trade in the South Seas, which is the term that is used really to describe South and Central America and its surrounding waters. Now, very specifically, the stated purpose of the company later was to supply around 4,800 enslaved people every year for 30 years to Spanish-owned plantations in Central and Southern America. And this was the nature of the contract, which was really at the heart of the South Sea Company's trading operations.
So then this company is part of a wider economy at this time that's drawing on the slave trade.
Yeah, certainly. It's impossible really to talk about kind of trading routes and ships and shipping without acknowledging that actually much of the trading that was going on was of enslaved people, as well as other kind of products and goods that were being shipped around the world. And although the South Sea Bubble is, often known and written about as a financial crash, there is another story there as well, which is that the nature of the contracts involved that were kind of shoring up this company were contracts to supply enslaved people to the Spanish-owned plantations.
And what can this tell us about Britain's place in global trade, including the slave trade at this time?
It's a reminder of what we know, that, Britain is emerging as a global trading nation, one of the most financially successful trading nations around the world. That the story of what's happening in the City of London with these rising values of stocks and shares is not one that's just contained to the City of London itself. It's not even contained just within the borders of Great Britain. It is, tied to a global economy, a geopolitical infrastructure, and that what's going to affect these values of stocks and shares, as well as just the puffing and the energy around it, is actually what's happening in these shipping routes too.
Well, what can you tell us about the British banking system at this time and the economy, how it operated? Were there many checks and balances? What was it going on to ensure things like this didn't happen?
Well, this is often described as a time of financial revolution in Britain at the time, in that we see the emergence of new systems of banking, of new ways of understanding debt and national debt, ways in which the government needs to raise money. And this creates a kind of, not a vacuum, but a space in which people can suggest new ideas, new ways of doing things. And that is what the South Sea Company basically is. It's a kind of an idea of a new way in which money might be raised, of which debt might be managed, of which government might be able to create an income from itself by inviting kind of public participation as well. So it's a kind of innovative scheme in some ways, and there's a space for that at the time where people are trying to find solutions to how a new economic infrastructure should operate.
And I guess that culture of innovation could help us understand a bit why people did get involved in this. It wasn't just stupid to fall for this. It's like Bitcoin, I guess. When new ideas are coming forward, why would you not give them a go?
Yeah, it is a kind of, the Bitcoin is a really great analogy, I think. And I'm not really a financial historian, but one of the things that I find particularly interesting around this idea of the South Sea Company and the energy that surrounds it is you do get an insight into the world of the City of London as a kind of active, energised place where people are sharing news in coffee houses, where the price and value of stocks and shares are being chalked up on the walls in the coffee houses, where people can create syndicates together to try and get in on this money. And it kind of brings to mind, we still have the image of stock exchanges today with all these people in their jackets waving their bits of paper, and who knows what's really going on. But a lot of that is happening in the streets and alleyways and coffee houses of London. And that's when you get the emergence of that kind of stock market energy.
So let's return then to October 1720, when it became clear that the South Sea bubble had burst. What happened when this news began to disseminate around London?
Well, our story of the fight breaking out between these gentlemen in the City of London really kind of captures this wave of, I think, shock and surprise and fear, really, about the ways in which what had been going up and up and up had suddenly started to crash down. And, because the opportunity for investment, the spirit of participation had been so great, I think that that shock really, spread very widely and very rapidly. We knew a little bit about famous individuals who reputedly either, made a fortune or lost a fortune in the South Sea moment. So, for instance, Isaac Newton is often referred to as a person who initially makes a gain when he first invests in the South Sea Company, but then, loses a significant amount of money when the crash comes. And he's calculated to have lost at least between £10,000, possibly up to £20,000 in the crash. But again, it's very difficult to be precise with those figures because there's no kind of account book for necessarily that we can draw on. So a lot of it is about reputation and just kind of stories of losses as well. But if we have a look as well at some of these other images of the time, we've got some satirical playing cards here which try to illustrate the range of people who potentially lost money in the crash. So let's have a look at this and see if that helps us a bit more figuring out who's involved in this story.
Yeah, so each of these, as you say, the playing cards, each of these has a different, really intricate design on it, with a different scene almost of people who I imagine have invested. A sea commander here, and then another card has a wealthy cobbler on it, and another one has a farmer who sold a small estate outright to buy South Sea, it says. And then also we've got a lady, like he referred to, women being involved as well, a lady who's pawned her jewellery to buy stock. So all of these different types of people losing money.
Yeah, that's certainly the kind of contemporary story of the moment is that all ranks of society are affected by this crash. We see that in the playing cards that it's affecting people like a cobbler and a farmer as well. It's not just the most rich and famous. Yes, so we can see from those playing cards, it's sort of suggesting that all of society is involved, from the rich to the poor, and that's a theme that carries through in lots of other source materials as well. So, for instance, one that caught my attention is a poem called "Stock, Jobbers and Bubbles" that was published in the newspaper The Weekly Journal or British Gazetteer on December the 31st, 1720. So exactly when everything has absolutely crashed and plummeted. And in that poem, we meet lots of characters who are sent to desperate measures, really, to try because of the loss of their fortune. So, for example, one is a certain goldsmith, when the stocks ran high, set up his coach, his pride to gratify. But South Sea falling left his coach's change, and shipping took the distant world to range. So he suggested he's had to flee the country. And then another character that's introduced in the poem is a ruined South Sea jobber of renown, leaps from a lofty window headlong down. When taken up, he cries, "Adzoons, I'm broke. Who gives £800 for South Sea stock?"
So he's been driven to suicide by this bankruptcy.
That's the suggestion, yeah, is that he's attempted to take his own life because he's lost his fortune in the crash. Yes, yeah.
I guess it's important to mention here that not necessarily everybody lost their money, because there was this rise before there was the crash. Did anyone manage to get out early?
Yeah, there's certainly a few who managed to get out early. So one person we do know potentially did quite well is Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, who's a very influential aristocratic woman at the time, and she's thought to have made around £100,000 profit.
Wow!
In her South Sea dabbling, and what she does successfully is she spots that this opportunity is going to be short-lived, and she gets out early, and she even writes, for her reasons for getting out of the scheme, and she notes, "Every mortal that has common sense or that knows anything of figures can see that it is not possible, by all the arts and tricks upon the earth, long to carry 400 million of paper credit with 15 million of specie. This makes me think that this project must burst in a little while and fall to nothing."
Well, she would have been a very good stockbroker today then.
She knew what was coming, and she got out quick, yeah.
But for those people who did lose significant sums, they must have been pretty angry.
Yes. I mean, it really rocked, society as a whole, and partly because it was all tied up as well with ideas of government involvement and national debt. And, a lot of the directors of the South Sea Company were, very eminent members of society. So there was a kind of call for an inquiry, a call for some kind of recompense for people to be held to account.
And was anyone held to account?
Yes, there was a parliamentary inquiry that followed, and that uncovered actually a lot of, really quite dark stories of insider trading and bribery as well, with those people who were the directors of the company also manipulating the value of the stock in ways that would now be considered to be illegal. And several company directors were actually punished. They were impeached and had their estates confiscated as a way to try and kind of remunerate some of those people who'd lost their money. But of course, the recompense was never of the scale of the losses. And I think the public mood was really summed up quite well by the writer Jonathan Swift, who himself had lost a significant amount of money in the crash and wrote about his experience. And he noted, "Thus the deluded bankrupt raves, puts all upon a desperate bet, then plunges in the southern waves, dipped over head and ears in debt."
So how should we see this case today? Was it an unfortunate economic accident? Was it corporate mismanagement? Or was it one big scam?
I think you could possibly write it in all of those ways, depending on what you wanted your headline message to be. I mean, it's often been described as a kind of pyramid scheme as well, for using kind of modern analogies. But none of those things are quite correct, in that there is a real company there. The South Sea Company is real. It's not just a paper company. It does complete various transatlantic voyages. I think it's something like 48 up to about 1720. And it does enact some of the basis of those contracts that formed the basis of the company originally. So it carries around 16,000 enslaved people during the course of its operations, many of whom actually tragically died during the journey. The South Sea Company is a real functioning company, but never on the scale in which it is promoted and puffed. So it never kind of hits the heights that were promised. So in that regard, it becomes more of an empty promise. It's a puffing. It becomes more of what we might associate with a pyramid scheme, more scammy in its kind of modern interpretations. But it is also a sense of financial accident, of an economic turn of events, because a lot of the kind of profits and losses of the South Sea Company are not entirely within the control of the company itself. It's based on the international relations and treaty agreements between different countries. So the Treaty of Utrecht, which gives Britain the right to trade with the Spanish plantations, but then also the falling apart later of international relations again and the outbreak of further war. So it's subject to global kind of economic fluctuations too.
We've spoken about impacts on individuals, but how significant was all of this on the nation's finances? Had Britain really gone bust?
I think it's sometimes difficult to get behind the hyperbole. So, the newspaper stories, the satirical prints we've seen, the narrative is of one of just an absolute massive financial crash, of people losing their fortunes, of the country being ruined by this speculation. But I think we also need to kind of read behind the lines of that a little bit. It feeds into a contemporary concern about gambling, about the nature of financial security, about the risks of speculation, the kind of dangers of just pursuing wealth for its own sake. And so that also kind of feeds into all of the kind of narrative puffery around this story. And I think, more recently, particularly economic historians have kind of challenged the idea that there is a real scale of loss there, that, in terms of an account sheets of, kind of incomings and outgoings, actually the impact on government finances was not as significant as the kind of news reporting around it might have suggested.
And you've alluded to a couple of things, but are there any parallels that you draw in the modern age with this?
Well, the South Sea crisis is referred to really as the world's first bubble, the world's first massive stock market crash. And it's still, picked up in stories today when we have massive economic fluctuations and other kind of moments of banking crisis and crashes in the modern world. There's often a sense of looking back to the South Sea Company as the first moment that happened. If anyone ever learns their lessons from history, who knows? But yeah, it's certainly seen as the first bubble.
And finally, Hannah, what do you think that the South Sea bubble scandal can tell us about the Georgian age?
Well, in part, the South Sea bubble is a story of the economy, of national debt, of international trade, of the creation of companies, the functionings of the stock exchange. So all the kind of nitty-gritty of a financial history. But I think it's also a story of a moment, an energy, an experience of the economy that draws in a whole range of people. So the promise of the opportunity to participate, the idea that the wealth and riches will be shared amongst anybody who can get a foot in the door, and then also the way in which, when those promises are not fulfilled, when things come crashing down, the whole of society is affected. It's a story of a kind of nation gripped in an excitement and then a massive disappointment. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so compelling.